Ladies and gentlemen, this is Scott Pollack, Chief Editor of the Critical Post Chicago, reporting. Welcome to another edition of the Goldwater Report. Thanks again for tuning us in, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, we appreciate it. Please go to the head page of the Critical Post Chicago and click on an ad to support our work here. Google will pay us. The headline is, ladies and gentlemen, the Socialist, Fascist propaganda media has lost round one on Britain leaving the EU, or the dumbed-down branding label phrase Brexit. Round one, the British people. Ladies and gentlemen, now that the inevitable has occurred in Britain, the Critical Post is here to offer this opinion in support of Britain's vote and their voting to take their destiny back into their own hands. The vote totals are as follows, ladies and gentlemen. The Remain vote tallied 16,141,241, which accounted for 48.1% of the vote. Leave tallied at 17,410,742, which accounted for 51.9% of the vote. Total votes cast stand at 33,551,983 in what has been remarked as an historic turnout of over 70% of the country. For folks wishing to understand British governance in the last century of progress by that island state, read Carroll Quigley's Tragedy and Hope from pages 125 forward to 176. That book is available as a free download on the head page of the Critical Post. Ladies and gentlemen, David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, is resigning his post in October. Jeremy Corbyn, Labour Party leader, is being asked to step down, and former Mayor of London Boris Johnson's star is on the ascendant. So, too, the same can be said for Nigel Farage, the leader of the UK's Independent Party, or UKIP. Farage, for quite some time, was the lone voice in the wilderness, and whose speeches, or rather tirades, on the floor of the EU Forum in Brussels have become quite famous on YouTube. The polling before the vote to all, especially the financial community worldwide, suggested that people in the Remain camp were in a position to prevail. As such, the tirades in the market the traders in the market remained complacent and took long positions on the British pound and the FTSE 100 futures as a whole as well. By mid-morning, however, when it was clear that the referendum to remain in the EU had failed, the British pound and markets across the world opened in a gap spiked downward. Further, it can now be shown that, in fact, the polls were more propaganda than reality. That propaganda war failed. It apparently was hoped that the fear-mongering by the financial community and political leaders worldwide would curtail the vote to leave. They did not succeed. The British press, or better stated, the British journalism channels, have remarked that, in fact, it was the Labour Party vote that delivered the victory to the Leave camp. The people who were most hit by 43 years of bureaucratic tyranny emanating from Brussels showed up and said, enough is enough. Liberal journalists were heard with cries of racism and such. The same things being said here in America. Now, apparently, the President of the United States and Hillary Clinton, both whom called for the Brits to remain, are on the wrong side of history. The fear-mongered invocation of Article 50 regarding the referendum is now to be invoked by the next Prime Minister of Britain. Article 50 contains protocols for the disengagement from the EU trade bloc and immigration policies. The President of the EU, the unelected President of the EU, leapt into the gap after the vote had become clear to affirm there is no vacuum of law after the vote and that all laws of the EU are still in effect until Article 50 protocol is completely enacted and the separation complete. When Article 50 is invoked by the next British Prime Minister, it sets up a 2-year withdrawal process of which the American journalism channels are sure to track, especially the financial market journalists. Now, Jeremy Corbyn, leader of Britain's Labour Party, faces a vote of no confidence at the hands of Labour's members of Parliament in the House of Commons. That vote will probably take place sometime next week and as early as next Tuesday. It should be remarked that Mr. Corbyn formed a tepid opposition to leaving. Also on the plate is a call by Scotland's Prime Minister for a new referendum for Scotland to secede from British rule. Scotland as a whole voted to remain in the EU by approximately 61%. Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, the jawboning of the political class here in America, which includes the clueless journalists about the British exit from the EU, has begun. It must be remarked that anemic growth of the British economy that has been as low as 1% in the last 5 years is part of the climate in which the Leave vote has prevailed. The American economy, like Britain's, has also been anemic, and during the present administration, under this feckless president, is the 4th worst average growth of any president in history and will be the only president in U.S. history that has never delivered a growth figure of 3% at any time during his administration. Much of this is perfectly aligned with Martin Armstrong's economic confidence model, which continues to show a downturn at least until October of this year. So too, ladies and gentlemen, it must again be remarked that there is about 90 million Americans that remain in a permanent depression, as shown by John Williams' ShadowStats website, which has real unemployment hovering near 25% of the nation. Turning back to Britain, here's the opinion of this anchor desk. What does this all mean? First of all, I'd like to remark off script, ladies and gentlemen, that the journalists in this country don't know anything about money, even the people that report about financial markets. They don't know anything about the laws that govern their money. They know nothing about the United States Code. They know nothing about the Uniform Commercial Code. They know nothing about economics, including the economists themselves. It must be remarked that we must understand that the economists in the think tanks in this nation are paid to provide financial reports that support a particular point of view. It's happening all the time. That's how they get their grants. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the British economy will do just fine and will return to a more robust rate of economic growth, which in turn will be good for America in the long term. We expect to see that a slow unraveling of the EU to continue as the Netherlands look poised to take up a referendum of their own, followed by Sweden and others. Britain's borders will become less porous, and the spread of Sharia courts in Britain will be put to a standstill and in the long run may begin to disappear from the British landscape. Currency speculators, including large American institutions, will try to punish the British pound for not complying with their interest, which, by the way, was spouted by the President of the United States not long ago. Some are saying this is far from over. However, we tend to disagree. The shouting match is over, and the British have a slow, hard march back to sovereignty. It's true. However, the highly monetized interests and King Washington, D.C. are going to make that march as hard as possible. We don't think the American oligarchic opposition will succeed, nor will the Germans succeed. Meanwhile, the Brit journalism channels will continue to act much the same as their American counterparts, remaining clueless about economics and the law their currency invokes. The global governance models are also being challenged. Hopefully, they will grind to a halt and the American military will stop being hoarded out in the name of global trade. The World Trade Organization, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and other modalities emanating from the United Nations will cease to carry the relevance they once did before the Brits' historic vote yesterday. It's time for Americans to realize its politically managed economy should be less controlled by the political class in Washington, D.C., and King Washington, D.C. should be put on its back heels. It's also time to realize that American journalists, along with their bias towards socialism, should be completely disregarded and regarded more like a bunch of doddering fools such as they are, merely actors reciting scripts prepared for them by their respective editorial desks, whom are all bought and paid for by the government and highly monetized interests. And we know this is occurring. And the CIA will continue to defend the dollar, but they will become more exposed for their perfidy and complicity in this exercise. It's also time for Americans to not regard the polling results here in America as anything but the poor propaganda tools they are. In other words, folks, don't pay 1 ounce of attention to them. Their methodologies are hardly a reliable tool for gauging what the broader American public is actually thinking, because it cannot be known until the election day has passed. In the broadest sense, it can be said that the politicians are poor stewards of any economy and cause more problems than they solve. It is more than reasonable to remark that the centralization models of the socialist, fascist, uber elite class in the long run does not favor the working class here in America, though the top CEOs would have you believe everything is just fine. The disconnect between what's going on in the financial markets in the world and what's going on in the lay population of this country couldn't be more apparent. Well, it may be just fine for them as long as they can continue their regime of stock buybacks on borrowed money with near zero interest rates, but for the lay population of the working class here in America, especially over the last 40 years, it has been a steady grind to the bottom. To conclude on a lighter note, ladies and gentlemen, Don Trump's campaign team has launched a website called lyingcrookedhillary.com. Very amusing. Again, this is Scott Pollack, Chief Editor of the Critical Post Chicago, reporting. Thanks again for watching another edition of the Goldwater Report. We'll be back soon. That is all.